rather than an abstract defense of free speech, I would just tell you my story. I have a lot of primary documents, and I think it's a very shocking story. Having lived through it, I'm still shocked that it happened. And I think it has really important implications for public health and for the practice of science. And I'm going to leave. I'm going to try to go for an hour and then leave a half hour for questions at the end. So I want this to be interactive. But the key thing I want to get across is that the government was the primary source of misinformation during the pandemic, and the government censored dissidents and critics to hide that fact. Okay, so just a very, very quick background on me and my activities during the pandemic. I'm a professor in the medical school at Stanford. I've been a professor for 20-some years. And I research infectious disease policy, infectious disease epidemiology, lots of other topics too, health policy, health economics, but certainly including those, it's been a long time interest of mine. In the middle of the pandemic, in October of 2020, I wrote a document called the Great Barrington Declaration. Anyone signed it in the rooms? God bless each of you. The document basically called for managing the pandemic in the way that we managed pandemics for the past century. It called for protecting vulnerable older people, because it was very clear from the epidemiological data that it was really older people that had the highest mortality risk if they were infected with the disease. And it called for lifting the lockdowns, including school closures, including all of the restrictions on normal life, because those lockdowns, it was also again clear from the data, were causing much more harm than good. And in particular, the lives of young people, it was causing much more harm than good, especially for the lives of children. This is the three of us. This is Martin Kulldorff. He was at Harvard University then, and Sunetra Gupta. She is at Oxford University. She's the professor of theoretical epidemiology at Oxford University. They're both rock stars, incredible scientists, decades long of experience publishing in epidemiology and biostatistics and in a whole host of fields. The document, I should say just up front, that the document itself was the least original thing I have ever written in my entire life. It had nothing really new in it. It just reflected what a century of pandemic planning and experience with managing pandemics had led, what we knew about pandemic management. It just distilled that into a one-page document that was understandable for the public at large. The key reason for the document, if you read it, you'll say, well, it's in simple language, Jay, how come there aren't 50 footnotes? How come there aren't like long detailed plans? Because what we wanted to do is we wanted to remind public health professionals that they were violating the normal pandemic management plan to a disastrous effect, and the scientific evidence, disastrous effect. And we wanted to tell the public at large that that was the case. We wanted to tell the public at large that there were scientists who disagreed with the way the pandemic was being managed, and that in fact there was a different way, that in fact there was not a consensus in favor of the lockdowns in October 2020 among scientists with relevant experience. Right? So really the most important thing about the document was Stanford, Harvard, Oxford. Right? It was to tell the public that you guys are not, if you thought the lockdowns were a crazy idea, that you never heard of such a thing before, it didn't make sense to you, that you were not the only ones, that there were in fact a tremendous number of scientists who disagreed with the lockdowns, who saw the harms they were causing, who understood how inefficacious they were, and who understood deeply that it was out of line with how pandemics were normally managed. Right? And it worked. We wrote the document on October 4th, 2020. Tens of thousands of doctors, epidemiologists, and scientists signed the document almost immediately. Almost 1 million people signed the document. And the principles. It actually is based on two very, very simple scientific facts that everyone agreed with then and everyone agrees with now. older people were at much higher risk if they get COVID than younger people. The younger people, the risk of getting COVID and dying from COVID was, much, much lower than the harms than they were facing from the lockdowns. And then second fact, that the lockdowns were harmful, that they were causing tremendous damage to the psychological, mental, to the psychological, physical, and economic well-being of every single person they affected, especially the most poor and the most vulnerable people of the world. So what we called for then was lifting lockdowns, young people, normal lives, and also equally important, better protection of vulnerable older people. The theory was that somehow protecting older people was possible only with a lockdown. Was already false in October 2020. It was false in March of 2020 when we imposed it, but it was certainly false by October 2020 when 40% of the deaths already had happened in nursing homes, despite the lockdowns. That 80% of the deaths have been people over the age of 65. Right, the lockdowns had already failed, and you don't need to squint very hard to see what the consequences of it. So Sweden. Oh, you have to see this slide. You can't miss this slide. This slide is the most amazing slide of the entire pandemic. Yeah. This slide is all-cause excess deaths in Sweden and the United States. You care to guess which line is which? Sweden followed something roughly like how normal respiratory virus pandemics are managed. Right? They didn't, for instance, force schools to close for anyone under the age of 16. The kids in Sweden had normal life, no masks, no social distancing, just regular childhood for the entirety of the pandemic. Not a single day were schools forced closed. And there may be a school here or there that was closed, but nothing for anyone under the age of 16. And in the spring of 2020, this was very clear it was very clear that what they had done already worked. That there were no kids that had died. In the summer of 2020, there was a report that came out that showed that the teachers themselves had lower deaths, COVID deaths, than the average of other workers in the population. So Europe opened schools on the basis of this evidence. The United States and many, many states kept them closed on the idea that we were going to protect human life better. But in fact, what happened was that the all-cause excess deaths, this is cumulative all-cause excess deaths since the start of the pandemic, accumulated body after body after body in the United States. That's the red line. The green line is all-cause excess deaths in Sweden per capita, and you can see that Sweden won the pandemic, if there is such a thing as winning a pandemic. I live in California. California had, my kids were out of school for a year and a half. My mom didn't leave her house for a full year and a half. It was an absolutely miserable lockdown time, especially in Northern California where I lived. Florida, I was an advisor to Governor DeSantis during the pandemic, and he opened schools in the fall of 2020. He opened businesses. Disney World was open in the summer of 2020. Disneyland didn't open until late into 2021. And Florida has lower all-cause excess deaths than California since the start of the pandemic. Right? So it's not that Florida did great, compared to Sweden, but that's partly because of our population is less healthy than the Swedish population. But it did better than California. The lockdowns didn't help protect human life. Lockdowns actually were damaging to human life as a whole. The pandemic policy that did not rely on lockdowns was the wiser strategy in retrospect, but it also at the time. Okay. End of epidemiology talk. Hopefully I don't have to convince most of you. If you all aren't convinced, save the questions for the end. I'm happy to discuss them about what we knew and what we didn't know. What I want to focus the talk on today is what was the response of government scientific bureaucrats and the government at large to these facts. And to preface this, I should say that the lockdown strategy was an absolutely extraordinary strategy. It required every single person who faced it to make tremendous sacrifices in their lives, in the lives of their children, and in the lives of their parents and anyone they loved. It required essentially, the ideology of the lockdown is that we must treat each other as biohazards primarily. And since we are primarily biohazards to each other, all the rest of the policies that follow from that idea as well as all the psychological, economic, and physical damage from the lockdowns follow from that central idea. How do you convince people who are used to living in community with one another to treat their neighbors as primarily biohazards? Well, at the very least, you have to have a absolute scientific consensus. There must really be no reasonable disagreement about this idea, or else people aren't just going to listen to you. And this animated government actors from the beginning of the pandemic. How do we convince people to lock down? How do we convince people to comply with the orders, to not send their kids to school, to close their businesses, to not go to church or to their synagogues or mosques? How do you convince people to stop living like human beings? And the key tool was scientific consensus. The key tool was that everyone who's an expert in the subject agreed. Anyone post something on Facebook and get the response, well, are you an epidemiologist? Anyone get that response? That idea that only experts could decide how we should live, that was, if we all lived through 2020, that was the primary idea that allowed the lockdowns to be implemented and enforced. So what happened? 4 days after we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, this is on October 4, 2020, the head of the National Institute of Health, a man named Francis Collins, a great scientist, the head of he was a man who was primarily responsible for the Human Genome Project, had been the head of the National Institute of Health for a very long time. A man I admired, actually, at the start of the pandemic. He wrote this email to Tony Fauci. And I'll just tell you the key words of it if you're squinting in the back. The key words, he said, hi, Tony and Cliff. Cliff was an aide to Tony Fauci. See the Great Barrington Declaration. The proposal from 3 fringe epidemiologists, Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, who met with the secretary, this is Secretary of HHS, seems to be getting a lot of attention. And even a co-signature from a Nobel Prize winner. Can't get any more fringe than that. There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of the premises. I don't see anything like that yet. Is it underway? Within a day or two of that, I started getting calls from reporters asking me why I wanted to let the virus rip, why I wanted to kill older people, why I wanted to let everybody die. There were stories like this in the Washington Post. Trump wants to try for herd immunity. Without a vaccine, it could kill millions. This was co-authored by the future head of the CDC, Rochelle Walensky. I'll just tell you, epidemiologically, the idea that herd immunity is a strategy is incoherent. Herd immunity is a biological fact. If there is immunity for a disease, even for some time, there's herd immunity. That is a standard idea in the epidemiology of infectious disease. It's not a strategy you follow. My colleague Martin Kulldorff, the way he tells it is, imagine you're flying an airplane and you decide you need to land the airplane. Is it a gravity strategy to land the airplanes as safely as you can? Gravity is just a reality. It's going to pull the airplane down. The only question, how best to land it safely. The same in epidemics. Herd immunity is a fact. It's a biological fact. The question is how best to manage the pandemic until the point that you've reached that fact most safely. Right? That was the dispute. But they used this idea of herd immunity as essentially an epithet to scare the living daylights out of people, as a synonym for everyone's going to get it. Everyone's going to die from it. We must do something. Could kill millions. We had the vaccine, it still killed millions. We had the lockdowns, it still killed millions. Okay. This takedown led to death threats to me, people who signed the declaration. Many faced direct attacks on their reputations, smears, their attacks on their livelihood. People who signed the declaration, they lost their university jobs, they lost grant opportunities. The head of the NIH writes this. He's sending a signal to other scientists, you better be quiet or else. Right? It's a tremendous abuse of power by the head of the National Institute of Health. Right? You cannot write this as the head of the National Institute of Health and expect to be taken as a legitimate way to deal with disagreement, right? The legitimate way to deal with disagreement would have been to hold a policy forum, right? He's the head of the National Institute of Health. He could have done that. Instead, he called for a devastating takedown of the premises of the Declaration. He called the three of us by an ad hominem attack, and then launched essentially a crusade against us. In order to do this, it's not enough just to use the press, because nowadays the key tool for public communication is social media. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, all of these fora are the key way that many, many people get information. And certainly during the pandemic, this was true. We learned a lot from the things that were posted on social media. The Great Barrington Declaration, the problem was that we didn't post it on social media, right? So it wasn't immediately subject to censorship. We posted it on a web page that we created. And that's how it got 1 million signatures. It was word of mouth. People from country after country started sending us translations of it for free, almost immediately. 40 different translations, sometimes multiple translations from the same country. It's spread by word of mouth on the web, but outside of social media. And until the devastating takedown came, it spread very widely. But then almost immediately after the devastating takedown, the spread of the idea on the internet stopped. And let me just give you a bit of a personal account of how this happened. Now, in October 2020, I wasn't on Facebook. I actually I've been telling for my graduate students for a decade, don't join social media, it's a waste of your time. Just write scientific papers, that's how you change the world. I now need to go back and apologize to every single grad student that I had. They probably can sue me for educational malpractice for telling them not to be on Twitter. Because it turns out Twitter is extremely important as a tool to spread your ideas in this day and age, including scientific ideas. I joined Twitter in August of 2021. Martin Kulldorff was already on Twitter back then, so was Sunetra Gupta. I joined in August 2021, and the very first thing I did is I posted the Great Barrington Declaration. In 2022, December 2022, Elon Musk bought Twitter. He bought it for $44 billion. One of the first things he did is he opened up the databases of Twitter and invited in journalists, including this journalist named a friend of mine, Barry Weiss, who runs an outfit called the Free Press. She's an amazing journalist. For whatever reason, she decided that she was going to look me up in the Twitter database because she suspected that something might have happened to me. I remember I joined in August of 2021. This is in December of 2022, or November of 2022, she does this search. And I don't know if you can see this. So she writes a Twitter thread with the very famous, now famous Twitter files. This is a picture of me from an internal Twitter database. And I don't know if you can see the words over there, but it says Twitter Trends Blacklist. Twitter had placed me on a blacklist. Did you know that Twitter had blacklists? It says it right here in the middle. Oh, right there in the middle, right there. Trends, that yellow thing in the middle right there. Trends Blacklist. Trends Blacklist. At that point, I'd had for academic, I guess this is a large number, is 200,000 followers, and I thought I was doing well. I didn't know anything about Twitter back then. I would post things, and all my followers would like it. I thought, gosh, I'm getting my word out. But that wasn't why I joined Twitter. I joined Twitter because I wanted to engage with people that disagreed with me. At least I wanted to have good faith discussion. I wanted people to hear what I was saying that hadn't heard about me before, hadn't heard about the Great Barrington Declaration before. That was the entire purpose of joining Twitter. What a Trends Blacklist does is that every single post I have, my followers can see it, so I think I'm doing fine, but it has no chance of going in front of people who don't follow me. So if a follower of mine likes my post, very often, if I'm not on a blacklist, it'll be shown to their followers. And you can sort of get this sort of ripple effect of your ideas, potentially. An idea of yours, a post of yours, a tweet of yours can trend, is the idea. A trend, if you're put on a trends blacklist, there's no chance of anyone outside your followers seeing your posts. The word itself is interesting, right? This is a word that last appeared in American history in the House Un-American Activities Committee, right? In the Cold War era. I thought we'd put that in the past behind us. Okay, so Elon Musk buys Twitter. This was the first tweet I ever did. Elon Musk buys Twitter, and he spends $44 billion. I'm on a trends blacklist, and he contacted me on my, where's my phone? It was on here. I think I still have the message via a friend of mine, and invited me to come up and see. I saw it with my own eyes. I saw this trends blacklist with my own eyes. And I asked the Twitter engineer who was helping me look at the database, when was I put on the trends blacklist? It turns out I was put on the trends blacklist in August of 2021, the day I put this post up. Right? I've been essentially on a trends blacklist continuously from the day I joined Twitter. Why did this post get Twitter to put me on a trends blacklist? Twitter is a company that succeeds by facilitating conversations among many, many people. They don't have an economic interest in putting me on a trends blacklist. Now, back before Elon Musk bought Twitter and I learned about the trends blacklist, I thought Twitter was just crazy. Why would they? They're silencing the discussion of scientists for nothing, I thought. But in fact, it wasn't just Twitter. This was almost certainly the result of a request by the federal government. And let me show you. Now, I don't have direct evidence of what I just said, but I have direct evidence that is very closely related to that for other people. And I'll show you the evidence in just a bit. Before that, more of the suppression. Let's go back in time. How long has it been going on? Well, in March of 2021, I was invited by Governor Ron DeSantis, who's there in the middle over there, to a panel in Florida on COVID policy. In particular, he was very, very interested in masking children. And so I prepared for this by looking up the literature on masking children. And it turns out there isn't any good literature on masking children. March of 2021, there wasn't a single randomized study that had been done on whether masking children had any effect whatsoever on the spread of COVID. And there were people that were writing me through the whole pandemic about their children and what effect masks had on their children, right? Moms and dads with autistic kids telling me that their kids were suffering wearing the mask. Moms and dads of children with hearing impairment telling me how difficult it was for their child to have to be surrounded by people with masks and what impact it was having on them. And so when the governor asked me whether masking children had any impact whatsoever on the pandemic, I said that there was no high quality evidence that suggested masking children had any effect, which is absolutely 100% true then and is still true now. There's still no randomized study documenting any effect of masking. In fact, no randomized study really done at all that shows any effect of masking children on the spread of the disease. And you can understand why, right? Anyone that has a child, especially a small child, it's very difficult to get them to wear a mask for extended. It gets very difficult for me as an adult to wear a mask for extended periods of time, right? And to ask children to do that, it made no sense. And of course, it likely had some harms, at least to some kids. By the way, I'm not wearing a jacket there because so I was kind of I'm a little bit absent-minded. I left my suitcase at home by the door, and so I arrived in Florida and I wandered around looking for a place where I could buy a shirt and a tie. So that's a cheap tie, and anyways, whatever. That's more than enough about me. This led, by the way, to attacks on me in my university. 100 of my colleagues, including in the medical school, wrote and signed a petition asking the president of the university to silence me. It was a secret petition. They circulated. A couple of friends of mine leaked it to me, and I told the press about it. And then the president had to say that he wasn't going to silence me. But more back to the point. A day after we recorded this is Governor DeSantis talking to three of his scientific advisors. On the screen is Sunetra Gupta. So there's me, Martin, and Sunetra, and then Scott Atlas is over there on the right. It's televised, right? A TV station televises this little conference. And so the people of Florida can see the scientific basis on which the governor is about to make decisions. Right? So he's about to pass a law that says no mask mandates in the state. And YouTube censored the video. And I was certain that there was going to be good government groups going to come out and say, well, look, it's like an act of transparency to show what advice a sitting governor is giving, right? Whether you agree or disagree with them, the people have the right to know. People of the state have the right to know. YouTube censoring it then is actually harming the act of good government. And in fact, that never happened. The ACLU didn't argue against it. No one came up and said, no one in the traditional civil rights settings, the electronic Frontier Foundation or whatever, these groups that are supposedly that look for and safeguard internet rights, none of them spoke up against it. It was actually completely normal. They censored the COVID roundtable. Just curious, who's heard of this roundtable before? Well, this is a select audience. Who's heard of the roundtable before?
Yeah. You should define censor, perhaps.
So they just removed it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That would be more clear.
Yeah. So you couldn't look at it. I have to say the key thing about that's just a great question, because the act of censorship in the modern age isn't let's burn every book so people can't read it. The act of censorship is let's ban as many of these things as we can, but the key thing isn't even the banning. The key thing is to put labels on it to make it outside it's as if you take all the National Geographics and put them in the back of the library, right? So that the kids can't go back and look at the pictures of the unclothed people in the National Geographic, right? It's to tell everybody that this is out of bounds. These are fringe ideas from fringe people that are dangerous.
Is the other part of it just dumping, like deluging people with information, basically?
Well, I mean, every single video on YouTube that has anything to do with COVID says the word, please click here for what the CDC says and thinks, right? That's just normal. But then many videos that they really don't like, that says this is misinformation, right? So they'll either get rid of it altogether. I guess our video was so dangerous that they wanted to get rid of it altogether, or they'll put those labels on it. The key idea is to tell the public that these thoughts are so dangerous that you shouldn't have them. That's really the most important thing that the censorship regime does. And if failing that, smear them, smear the people so that they can't. So that was March 2021. Let's go back in time to October of 2020. The censorship regime in social media was there even then.
I was gonna say, sometimes when you even search the title of the video on YouTube, it doesn't show it.
You can't find it. There's search bans.
Unless you have the link.
Yeah. It makes it so that the internet is unsearchable, right? In fact, that's what happened in the Great Barrington Declaration initially. So this was from October of 2020. We write the declaration October 4th, October 8th. We get the devastating takedown. We learn later, ex post. A week after that, I started getting emails from friends of mine in other countries saying, "Jay, I can't find the declaration on Google. Where is it?" Google had removed it from many foreign language searches. And in English language searches, if you search for the declaration, you get 3 pages of hit pieces, and then you get the declaration. Right? So Google censors, in the sense I meant it, the declaration. The question is why? Right? This is October of 2020. Now I'm going to go back in time some more, and this is from February of 2020. This is an email from Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook. And you can't read this. I'll just read small parts of it. I'll just summarize it for you. It's an email from Mark Zuckerberg to Tony Fauci, unbidden, very early in the pandemic. And what Zuckerberg offers is 2 things. He offers Tony Fauci let's record a little podcast together. So they record a podcast. That's completely fine, legitimate, right? You absolutely should be allowed to do that. But he also offers something that's redacted. See the blacked out text? I don't know what that is. Which Tony Fauci is very excited about. And Facebook systematically starts labeling posts that disagree with the CDC, starts taking down posts that agree with the CDC, that disagree with the CDC. Anyone have posts taken down by Facebook?
I had my account locked.
And
And I linked to the CDC. I linked to data on the CDC, and they decided that violated the CDC recommendations and locked my account.
we'll get back to that, because it turns out the White House itself was snared by by the censorship regime that it induced. We'll talk about that in a bit. The cooperation between private companies and the government in the communication setting is a very interesting thing. Facebook, Twitter, all of these essentially are subject to something called Section 230, right? They're not publishers. What they are closer to the telephone company, right? The telephone company is not supposed to censor me when I call you and tell you something, right? They're not even supposed to be listening to us. The Section 230 essentially says the law treats these companies as if they're more like the phone company than they are publishers. Publishers can be sued for publishing defamation. Social media companies can't. The bargain is that they don't have much editorial control. Here you have a cooperation, admitted cooperation between the government and social media companies about how to manage the flow of information that's going through their settings from the earliest days. Now, this looks like voluntary cooperation, but I'm going to tell you that this, over time, gets modified, especially during the Biden administration, into something much more sinister, where the government threatens social media companies, the very existence of them, unless they cooperate in the censorship demands of the government. This was Tony Fauci's response. He was very, very excited by the offer to Zuckerberg that they have an interview of, Zuckerberg interviews Tony Fauci early in the pandemic. Again, nothing wrong with that. It's the blacked out part that I'm much more concerned about. I'll show you, what I think the blacked out part is in a bit. And of course, when we put up the Facebook, the page for the Great Barrington Declaration, it got deleted for a week with no explanation for why. It came back up, but by then, if you shared the fake Great Barrington Declaration, you might get your account blocked. Okay, I've gone back in time. Let me go now back forward in time again to now the Biden administration, because the Biden administration, I think that the censorship regime began before the Biden administration. I think it began during the Trump administration, not specifically as the Trump policy, but as policy of the CDC, policy of the Surgeon General's office, policy of many other organizations within the government. The Trump administration did nothing to stop it. But when Biden came into power, among the very first acts he did was to weaponize the federal government to censor Americans. And the reason why was that he was very concerned that Americans would not take the vaccine. That was the primary set of concerns that animated the COVID-related censorship activities of the Biden administration in 2021. I think this is April. When was this? I can't read the. July 2021. This is the Surgeon General of the United States, a man named Vivek Murthy. He warned that misinformation is an urgent threat to public health. An urgent threat to public health. The problem is that by July 2021, the vaccine campaign that the United States government had undertaken had stalled and failed. The number of people taking the vaccine peaked sometime around April of 2021 and then declined very sharply after that, never to recover. And the government convinced itself the reason why was that people were hearing misinformation about the vaccine online. Misinformation like if you get the vaccine, that doesn't stop you from getting COVID. Everyone heard that piece of misinformation? Wait, that's not misinformation. That's actually the truth, isn't it? More misinformation. There are people who got the vaccine that were injured by the vaccine. That's a huge piece of misinformation that they were. Wait, is that misinformation?
No, that's true, isn't it?
It's true.
Yeah.
Especially young men. The evidence already emerged by then that there were young men that were getting myocarditis heart inflammation in my view at rates high enough to warrant freezing the vaccine for them. The government itself had already put out a warning about the vaccines for the J&J vaccine. In April of 2021, it paused the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because of clotting in young women, 50 and younger. Right? That was the reason why they paused the vaccine. The problem was that this information, true information, that the government didn't want out was getting out. And they were absolutely livid. Right? President Biden had promised that he would smash the virus. July 2021, remember the speech where he said you can go out and have a barbecue masked in the backyard with your friends if only everyone got vaccinated? But he couldn't declare victory then because the vaccination campaign had stalled. And the Surgeon General of the United States then put out a call for Americans to rat each other out over misinformation. An open call to tell on your fellow citizens who are talking about, who are spreading ideas that the government didn't like. I said at the beginning of the talk that the government was the #1 source of misinformation during the pandemic. Let me justify that. In response to his call for ratting Americans out who were spreading misinformation, I wrote a letter to the Surgeon General in response to this, pointing out that the government was the #1 source of misinformation. Right? I wrote this again with Martin Kulldorff and the Attorney General of Indiana. So we agree that misinformation was a major problem during the pandemic. We submit the following examples of disinformation from the CDC and other health organizations that have shattered public trust and public health. Right? So what did we say? There's a long list of these, but I'll just give you a few. Questioning natural immunity. If you have COVID and recover, do you have some immunity? Yeah, the evidence was abundantly clear actually in 2020. Until there's a new variant, actually, you're probably protected against reinfection. Very, very low rates of reinfection until there's a new variant. That was very clear. If you have immunity after COVID recovery, what happens to the marginal benefit, such as it is if you get the vaccine? Well, it's much lower, right? If you already have immunity, what the absolute positive effect of the vaccine is much lower as a result. And so this is something we're quite afraid about. If people realize that if you have immunity recovered, you don't really need the vaccine quite as much, you're not going to demand the vaccine quite as much. And so they suppress the idea that there is such a thing as immunity. Actually, in October 2020, the World Health Organization changed its web definition of herd immunity to exclude immunity from natural sources, of immunity after recovery, including only vaccination-related immunity. The COVID vaccines prevent transmission. Do they do that? No. They don't do that. In fact, the randomized trials for the vaccines that were completed in 2020 didn't check whether they stopped transmission. They could have, right? So you have a group of people that were randomly assigned to the vaccine, and you have a group of people that are randomly assigned to placebo. If they wanted to check for whether it stopped transmission, just check the spouses. What fraction of the spouses get it? But they didn't do that. Why didn't they do that? In any case, they didn't do that, and so they didn't know that it did or didn't stop transmission. And it was very clear from the data by July 2021, in country after country, heavily vaccinated country after heavily vaccinated country, there were huge outbreaks of cases. There was a major political crisis in Israel as a result of a huge increase in cases, despite, was it like 90% of the population of Israel, was 95% of the population being vaccinated. Vaccinated could spread COVID. It also meant the vaccine mandates were irrational, right? The idea of the vaccine mandates, it's not just that you're biohazard. If you get the vaccine, you become clean. And so we have to separate the clean from unclean. And so you need mandates to force everybody to be clean and isolate and quarantine and make the lives of the unclean miserable. until they decide to become clean, right? But if there's immunity after COVID recovery, you can be clean without having had a vaccine. School closures were effective and costless. How'd that work out, you guys? Sweden has no learning loss through the pandemic for its kids. Our kids are up to 2 years behind. It's the biggest driver of inequality in the history of mankind outside of war. And it's going to be the story of the next 50 years in the United States, of this generation of kids, how we destroyed the basic birthright they had to an education. It's worse, by the way, in poor countries. In places like Uganda, the Philippines, and India, there were years, 2 years or up to 2 years, with kids didn't have any school, not just no Zoom school. And many kids, millions, in the tens of millions, never returned to school. Everyone is equally at risk of hospitalization and death from COVID infection. Is that true? That was clear from the data in the earliest, from the Diamond Princess data. It was clear from a study I ran in the early days of the pandemic, the Santa Clara seroprevalence study, the LA County seroprevalence study, again, another study I ran. But it was clear, just looking at the epidemiological data, of who's dying. Why would you say that everyone's equally at risk when they weren't? The key thing is compliance. You remember there was a NBA star named Rudy Gobert at the beginning of the pandemic. He got sick with COVID, and he got better. But he gave a press conference where he joked around about it very early on, licked his finger, licked the microphone, and then he was made to like apologize abjectly in this sort of Chinese-style struggle session. Why? Because if young people understood how low a risk they had of dying from COVID, they wouldn't have complied with lockdowns. Yet they would. So the idea that there is a risk stratification that we ought to take advantage of, that was misinformation. The idea that mask mandates are effective at reducing the spread of viral infectious diseases, especially ones that are airborne. Anyone have to get their glasses fogged up when they wear a mask? If you have glasses, what is that? That's virions escaping up the sides of the mask, right? The eradication of COVID-19 is a feasible goal. Who heard from your friends that zero COVID is the only way out, the only way forward? Epidemiologically, it made no sense. This is a disease that's carried by white-tailed deer. Apparently bats get this thing. You have a disease that has non-human reservoirs, you can't eradicate it, right? You have a disease that is spread basically on every country on Earth with no vaccine that can actually stop you from getting and spreading it. You can't eradicate it. The reason we have not eradicated the flu or other coronaviruses. I could go on. We had a long list. All of these were much more important in terms of the misinformation that actually led to action than anything that was put online about 5Gs or I don't even understand the nature of these like ideas, but like 5Gs and vaccines are magnetic or whatever. All of that is a version of nut picking, right? You pick something that's outlandish as the government, say, oh look, someone's saying this outlandish thing, and focus all the attention on the outlandish thing while you yourself are saying catastrophically devastating lies that are leading to huge harm for vast numbers of people. Okay. So now let me get to back up some of the things I was saying earlier. There was a committee in the House that was formed to look at the COVID crisis, and one of the things they did is they brought in people from Facebook. They brought in people who were involved in the censorship activities inside the government. They brought in people from quasi-governmental organizations that were involved in the censorship activities. I'll talk more about that later in just a bit. But the point is that they used the power of the federal government to actually try to figure out what was going on regarding censorship. And this is in 2022 they were doing this, 2020. What they found was a massive governmental pressure campaign on the social media companies. I'll just highlight a bit from it. This is from an amicus brief for a court case I'll tell you about in just a bit. The government's pressure campaign worked. The Facebook agreed to moderate COVID-related speech in response to pressure from the Biden administration. Pressure was direct and coercive. The COVID lag leak theory, an executive charge of content policy development said, the company censored the COVID lab leak theory, an executive in charge of content policy said, because we were under pressure from the administration to do so. The kinds of interactions weren't innocent, right? Another Facebook executive notified his team, a senior advisor to President Biden was outraged that Facebook did not remove a meme that bothered the administration. They wanted jokes taken down. The Biden administration pressured Facebook to censor information about COVID vaccine side effects, even if the information was true. The nature of the information they censored was vaccine-injured people forming groups on Facebook to talk with each other about how best to manage which doctors were good, which doctors were bad, what had worked for some people, sharing information. Every patient group has the right to share. They took that down at the order of the federal government.
Is that new category, malinformation?
Every piece of information is malinformation.
Is the purpose of the government, they know that these things are correct, this information is correct. Is their purpose like behind the scenes subjugation of people? What's the purpose?
The purpose is to convince you to take the vaccine. That was the purpose of this campaign. That's multifaceted. It's in a matter of some speculation. I mean, I think there are some economic reasons for it, pecuniary reasons for it, but I also think that the advisors that were advising the Biden administration on the vaccines were absolutely convinced it was the only way out of the pandemic. They just misread the evidence. And they had no respect for human rights. Okay. There's more from this. The federal government threatened big tech with the repeal of Section 230. Remember I mentioned Section 230 before? If you repeal Section 230, that means the Facebook and Twitter, as soon as somebody posts some defamatory content on there, Facebook could be sued, Twitter could be sued. That's the end of social media, right? It's an existential threat to the viability of the social media companies. The federal government threatened big tech with the repeal of Section 230 to induce compliance with its censorship campaign. Zuckerberg referred to the possibility of antitrust enforcement as an existential threat to his empire. This is not theoretical. The Biden administration has already engaged in antitrust action, for instance, against Apple just most recently. Internal documents show that Facebook executives feared the Biden administration retaliated against the company for not censoring enough. Right? These were threats to these social media companies. It wasn't just an organic campaign. The federal government was threatening social media companies to censor you or else that they would be destroyed. There's a really funny story that comes out of this and some of the other documents that I've seen. I don't know if I'll show it to you. Remember I mentioned in April 2021, the CDC had announced that this Johnson & Johnson vaccine should be paused. Anyone get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in the room? It was paused. Why was it paused? Because there was a safety signal found for blood clotting in young women, 50 years old and up, right? Actually, my colleague Martin Kulldorff had written a piece he was on the CDC's advisory committee, for the statistical advisory committee, and he didn't think the statistical evidence was strong enough to warrant pausing the vaccine then, for the J&J vaccine. So he wrote a letter to the public saying that it wasn't right, that there wasn't enough statistical evidence. The CDC fired him for being too pro-vax. By this time, in April 2021, the Facebook had already set up this regime to police anti-vax speech. It's not just one post at a time. It was machine learning tools to identify millions and millions of posts by regular people, to label them, to take them down, to suspend your account if you post them, any anti-vax speech. The White House shared the fact that the CDC had paused the J&J vax on its Facebook page. And it got ensnared by this algorithm. And the White House itself became an anti-vax group in the eyes of Facebook, thanks to the algorithm that the White House itself had put in place. There are emails from the White House to Facebook, yelling at them, saying, why have you slowed growth on our page? Why have you put us on a blacklist? And you see Facebook executives sheepishly write back saying, oh my gosh, we're very, very sorry. We inadvertently deemed you anti-vax. I mean, censorship is not good for anybody, right? Okay, so that was from the House Judiciary Committee, the House Weaponization Task Force Committee. The next thing I want to tell you about is a case that I'm involved with called the Missouri versus Biden case. Move forward in time. In August of 2022, the Missouri Attorney General's office contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in a case against the Biden administration in order to find out whether they actually were involved in censorship, right? But in August 2022, I knew none of the stuff that I just told you, right? This was all hidden behind the scenes so that no one would know. The shadow ban, the Twitter blacklist, I didn't know about. All of it just was in the dark. Why would this be happening, I thought? So I thought, and I had actually pursued the idea and decided against it to sue the social media companies, because I could tell that there was some weird censorship going on for me. Like I showed you the YouTube thing. But I decided that as a single individual, I would have no chance of winning. But if you have a state attorney general's office behind you, maybe you have a chance of winning. At the very least, you can learn what's going on. So the Missouri and Louisiana attorney general's office brought a lawsuit in August of 2022 against the Biden administration. It's called the Missouri versus Biden suit. And the suit resulted in I'll show you the evidence we developed, but it resulted in us allowing be able to interview under oath people like Tony Fauci, Jennifer Psaki's aide, the White House spokesperson's aide, the people in the CDC, high officials in the CDC, the Surgeon General's office, the FBI, the State Department, the Center for Internet Security, so CISA it's called, a very wide range of federal government officials. The judge in the case, a man named Terry Dowdy, Justice Terry Dowdy, issued this injunction on July. So this was our we asked for was an injunction based on the evidence we had developed in the case. We asked that the government be forced to stop censoring, to force this government to stop contacting social media companies for the purpose of censoring. And so here's what we wrote. We wrote that my attorneys wrote. This case involves some of the most egregious First Amendment violations in American history. Federal officials from the White House and multiple agencies used pressure, threats, coercion, cajoling, collusion, demands, and trickery and deceit to induce social media platforms to censor speakers and viewpoints on social media that federal officials disfavor. The censorship regime, the goal of it was to make sure that people could not, the American people could not effectively criticize government policy. That was the primary goal of it. White House officials like Rob Flaherty, Andy Slavitt, and Jennifer Psaki have engaged in a relentless pressure campaign, both in public and private, to coerce platforms into censoring disfavored points of view. Surgeon General Murthy and staff coordinated closely with the White House in this pressure campaign, causing social media platforms to scramble and assure federal officials, we hear your call to do more to censor disfavored viewpoints. The CDC flagged specific social media posts for censorship, organizes Beyond the Lookout meetings to tell platforms what should be censored, and serves as the ultimate fact checker with final authority to dictate what speech will be removed. Dr. Fauci orchestrated an elaborate campaign of trickery and deception to induce social media platforms to censor the lab leak theory and other viewpoints he disfavors. We got to depose Tony Fauci for 8 hours. It was, it's actually, unfortunately, very anticlimactic. You can go see the full 8 hours. He says, I don't recall, in response to basic scientific questions 174 times during the course of the deposition, which is remarkable for a man who is the science himself. One would think you'd not forget anything. Dr. Fauci and Collins collaborated to inflict a deceptive, quick, and devastating takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration, co-authored by plaintiffs Dr. Bhattacharya and Kulldorff. Since Dr. Cliff Lane's trip to China at Dr. Fauci's direction in February 2020, Dr. Fauci and the government establishment favored a Chinese government's novel tactic of aggressive lockdowns to control the virus spread, so the Great Barrington Declaration was a grave threat to the credibility of lockdown policies. The government didn't just act on its own, though. It also used universities and NGOs to launder its censorship requests, to make it to do things that if they were to do it directly would be very, very obviously violations of the First Amendment. I'm sad to say that my own university was involved in this. There's an organization inside at Stanford University called the Stanford Internet Observatory. CISA and GC. CISA is a State Department affiliated group inside the federal government. Federal health officials at the Surgeon General's Office, the CDC, and HHS collaborate in a similar censorship enterprise called the Virality Project, which procures censorship of enormous quantities of First Amendment protected speech. Alex Stamos, who's the director, the director of this Stanford Internet Observatory with their Virality Project, has publicly stated that the EIP, the Election Integrity Project, which became the Virality Project, because the censorship wasn't just about COVID, it was also about claims that the election was not on the up and up, the 2020 election was not on the up and up, has publicly stated that the EIP was formed in part because the government lacked legal authority to engage in the EIP's work. The EIP tries, and this is in Stamos' word, to fill the gap of the things the government cannot do themselves. Rene DiResta, another high official in the Stanford Virality Project, also admits the EIP was designed to get around the problems of very real First Amendment questions that would arise if the federal officials did the EIP's monitoring and censorship work directly.
But could you clarify, are you reading the pleadings or are you reading the...
These are the pleadings. The federal judge agreed with us on the pleadings because based on the data we developed.
No, we can say whatever we want.
Right, so federal judge, let me get to that. I'll show you what the federal judge agreed. The federal judge agreed with this.
All right.
Yeah. Let me just describe how it works. The National Science Foundation gives a grant to the Stanford Virality Project for misinformation studies, research. The Virality Project develops an algorithm, a set of really keywords to identify themes of misinformation at scale. They go to Facebook, they go to Google, they go to Twitter or whoever, and they say, look, we're Stanford University, we've been doing research, this research will help you identify misinformation and take it down. They push for changes in the terms of service. These are all in the depositions and other data we got from Discovery. And then the platforms just very often just do it, more than half the time. The government then cooperates very closely in close communication with these NGOs and universities, and tells them, look, here's what we want censored. Then the universities go to the social media companies and say, here's what you should censor. So it doesn't look like it's coming from the government. That's Stanford. MIT did this data visualization. There's a group at MIT where they identified the anti-mask network on Twitter. This is in 2021. Alex Berenson was one of the primary people who was like spreading anti-mask nonsense. Elon Musk is up over there. A whole bunch of people, it's kind of a loose configuration of people that was calling itself Team Reality. Mainly they were concerned about the lack of randomized evidence and the lack of real world evidence that masking was doing much good. And so the MIT, there's a group inside MIT that identified these folks as the bad guys. And then social media companies censored them. Alex Berenson lost his account as a result of this. Andrew Slavitt, senior advisor to President Biden's COVID response team, this is in 2021, complained specifically about me. This is from a pleading by Alex Berenson, in his case, Berenson versus Biden. According to a Twitter employee in another Slack conversation discussing the White House meeting, they really wanted to know about Alex Berenson, the employee wrote. Andy Slavitt suggested they'd seen data visualization, that's the MIT one, that showed that he was the epicenter of disinformation that radiated outwards to the persuadable public. So MIT folks do a data visualization. The Biden administration picks up on it and goes to social media companies and says, you have to censor these people, take these people down because they're spreading ideas we don't like. True ideas that they don't like. And these are from documents in Discovery. So the Disinformation Dozen, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, CCDH, did a report, a very, very influential report. You can see it there on your left. Why platforms must act on the 12 leading online anti-vaxxers, which included presidential candidate RFK Jr., which led to his being censored online. It was a central part of why Vivek Murthy put out this call for ratting out people who were censoring. On July 4th of 2023 of this last year, the judge in our case, the Missouri versus Biden case, issued a preliminary injunction. Then it was later appealed by the Biden administration to the Fifth Circuit, which heard the case and then upheld the preliminary injunction. So just to set some thresholds, a preliminary injunction is a big deal, right? So you have to, in order to get a preliminary injunction, it's before the trial is actually held. So I can't exactly answer your question yet fully. But usually you have to, in order to get a preliminary injunction like the one I'm about to show you, the judge has to believe that we're very likely to win the case. And the Biden administration, when it appealed it, was saying, look, we still don't think they're going to win the case. But the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the injunction. There's more to the story in just a second, which I'll tell you, but I wanted to set the stage. This is July 4, 2023. Here's what the judge in the case wrote from the Missouri versus Biden case. The plaintiffs have presented substantial evidence in support of the claims they were victims of a far-reaching and widespread censorship campaign. The court finds they are likely to succeed on the merits of their First Amendment free speech claim against the defendants. They are likely to succeed on the merits in establishing the government has used its power to silence the opposition. Opposition to COVID-19 vaccines, opposition to COVID-19 masking and lockdowns, opposition to the lab leak theory of COVID. The evidence produced thus far depicts an almost dystopian scenario. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a period perhaps best characterized by widespread doubt and uncertainty, the U.S. government seems to have assumed a role similar to an Orwellian ministry of truth. That's the words of a federal judge. The Fifth Circuit modified the order. They upheld the injunction, right? So sometimes by the way, who'd heard of the Missouri versus Biden case before? Wow, you guys are an amazing audience. All right. If I ask a regular, you guys are like superhuman. If I ask a regular human audience, I don't get very many hands. It was actually kind of not as widely publicized as it ought to. I think it's the most important First Amendment case of the 21st century, maybe the most important one of the last 50 years. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld it. If you saw stories about this, they would say things like, oh, they pared down the order. They did, but not in ways that people realize. I'll describe that in a minute. But they upheld the preliminary injunction. The defendants and their employees of the agency shall take no actions, formal or informal, directly or indirectly, to coerce or significantly encourage social media companies to remove, delete, suppress, reduce, including through altering their algorithms, posted social media content containing protected free speech. That includes but is not limited to compelling the platforms to act, such as by intimating that some form of punishment will follow a failure to comply with any request, or supervising, directing, or otherwise meaningfully controlling the social media company's decision-making processes. Under the modified injunction, the enjoined defendants cannot, that's the Biden administration, cannot coerce or significantly encourage a platform content moderation decisions. Such conduct includes threats of adverse consequences, even if those threats are not verbalized and never materialized, so long as reasonable person would construe a government message alluding some form of punishment. The circuit court justices, the appeals court justices, they analogized the censorship campaign to Al Capone in Chicago, the mobster going to a business and saying, that's a really nice business you got there. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. They wrote that in an appeals court case. And you can see so the U.S. First Amendment was restored for about a day before it was then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Rich, you said before that about 50% of people just comply right off the bat because they're like, I don't want to deal with this, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting if you read these back and forth between the social media companies and the government. Some of the time they push back. The social media companies push back, say, look, this is true. Are you sure you want us to censor this? Right. And so, but you can see that they're treading on like dangerous ground. They don't want to push so far that the government says, screw you, we're going to go, we're going to take you out.
Right.
A devastating takedown.
When you said that at first, it immediately made me think of extortion and Capone.
Well, the circuit court justices agreed with that. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. In fact, I went to the oral arguments last couple weeks ago. And so they're hearing the case on the preliminary injunction. The case is still going to be tried. It probably won't be done for 2 or 3 years, right? We still won't have a trial ruling for 2 or 3 years. The Supreme Court is heard and is considering whether the preliminary injunction I just read to you should stand or not stand.
How did we get from Missouri versus Biden to Murphy versus Missouri?
Oh,
Why does Biden's name out of it?
Yeah. So
Why are the plaintiffs-
the Fifth Circuit in the Fifth Circuit ruling, they took Biden out of it. They said Biden can say whatever he wants. He can go online and say that Facebook is killing people. That's part of his right as an American citizen to speak. And he's not the one that went to the social media companies directly, and so we're not enjoining him against anything. So the injunction then is about the federal government as a whole, not Biden specifically. Murphy was the second listed defendant, so it's Murphy and it's Missouri is the case. So that's why it's Murphy versus Missouri. So it's the federal government that's appealing the injunction, so they're the applicant to the Supreme Court, so they go first.
So is that Fifth Circuit injunction still in place until they make a ruling? Or
No, the Supreme Court stayed the injunction, and the oral argument was whether to lift the stay on the injunction. And we'll know in 2 months. Let me just tell you what happened there. So there's a few issues, few key issues. First of all, I have to say I went in convinced there was going to be a 9-0 decision in our favor, because this is such an obvious, gross violation. I came out depressed, thinking that we're going to lose. I don't now, in retrospect, I don't know that. I don't think I think we might still win, but it's not a slam dunk.
Well, no, it's not if there's a contention.
Well, we'll talk about that, right? So there's a couple of issues that were brought up that are interesting, actually, from a policy point of view. I wanted to emphasize. There's a lot of technical stuff that I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to go deep into, but there's a couple I think that the general public should know about. One is about standing and traceability, right? And the question really is not, these are technical ideas that lawyers deal with, but the key thing is who should have the right to sue to defend the First Amendment? The government's contention is that in order to have the right to sue, you need to produce a chain of emails from Vivek Murthy or whoever inside the government to social media companies saying you must censor these people and this person for saying this. And then the social media company says, oh yeah, I'll do this, and I would never have done this except for the fact that you've done this. Right? That's the standard the government essentially is arguing for a standard to sue. If that standard is upheld, then the First Amendment is a dead letter. Because what the government does is not primarily silence this person. What the government does is it goes to social media companies and says, silence these ideas. And any person that says those ideas or that online gets censored. That means that they won't know they're censored. This is not speech by the government that's open and says, look, I disagree with Mark Zuckerberg about X, Y, and Z. That's completely legal. This is in the shadows telling the social media companies to silence you all when you all don't even know it. Put you on a blacklist and you don't know that you're on a blacklist. Right? That's something entirely different than speech. It's the death of speech. And if the Supreme Court rules that we don't have standing to sue, the First Amendment is dead. Both the lower court and the appeals court heard the same arguments from the Biden administration about standing and rejected them on this basis. So hopefully, at the very least, we don't lose on that. There was a second argument, which is that the government, the First Amendment, should protect the government's right to speak. Right? In fact, there is a long-standing sort of idea that the president and the administration ought to have the bully pulpit. Right? They can get up and say, Facebook is killing people. right? They can President Biden can get up and openly say that if you're in for a long winter of discontent if you're unvaccinated. If you're unvaccinated, you're a threat to others. You can go up and say all the misinformation he wants, and he has absolute First Amendment right to say that as a citizen of the United States, right? And nothing in the Missouri versus Biden case stops him from doing that. The injunction doesn't stop him from doing that. The injunction says that his administration can't go behind the scenes and tell the social media companies, silence Jay, or silence people who are posting the Great Barrington Declaration. That's what it says. There was this is really funny. The newest justice, Justice Ketanji Jackson, had a couple of moments that probably made the headlines. If you heard of the case, this is probably where you heard about it. At one point, she expressed shock, or maybe, I don't know, I've never been to an oral argument before, so maybe this was just her way of like dealing with hypotheticals. I'm told that often the justices do this. But to my ears, it was a shocking thing to hear from a justice, where she expressed shock that the First Amendment might constrain the ability, that might hamper the activities of the government. I mean, I'm just a fringe epidemiologist, but like I have to say, like if you look at this, I look at the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. I mean, isn't that supposed to hamper the activities of the government? You know, when it violates our basic civil rights. The other thing she did, it was a hypothetical, and again, this might just be her working through something, so I don't know what this means for her, how she'll vote. But the hypothetical was this: suppose that there's a social media fad of kids jumping out of windows. So I film myself, I'm a 14-year-old, I jump out of a first one-story window, and then some kid one-ups me and jumps out a two-story window and a three-story window, right? And there's a social media fad of you filming yourself jumping out of windows. Shouldn't the government have the right to censor that? Shouldn't the government have the right to censor that? So my reaction to this is two things. One, metaphorically, it was the government that was telling kids to jump out of windows during the pandemic. The government closed the schools. The government fear-mongered and panicked. And then they censored the people that are telling the kids not to jump out of windows.
I think their assumption is people don't have brains to think for themselves.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is censoring this social media fad the best way? Why not just tell parents to tell your kids not to jump out of windows? I mean, like that seems like would be more effective. And kids are smarter than, I mean, whatever, maybe they're not. The premise of this seems to be that the government is all-knowing. And then finally, the third last thing I'll talk about that happened in the Supreme Court, there's a lot more that happened, but this is the three I wanted to focus on. Is there a vaccine exemption to the First Amendment? This is what the government argued. The government argued that it was a big emergency. It was vital that everybody get vaccinated. The First Amendment was making that very, very difficult, and so it's okay to violate the First Amendment in the midst of an emergency. And so normally I would just verbally say the answer to the question, but I kind of had to put it on the slide. No, there is no emergency exemption to the First Amendment. In fact, what I'd argue is that it's during an emergency that the First Amendment is most important, because the government is going to get things wrong, and when it gets things wrong, it does vastly more damage than when a private citizen gets something wrong. So it is absolutely vital that the citizens of this country be able to tell the government that they got it wrong. The First Amendment is absolutely essential for public health. It protects the health and well-being of each of us by allowing us to correct the government when it gets things wrong. Now, one of the frustrations I had in the oral argument was that our lawyer didn't do as much as I think he should have to make the case that it was really the government that got it wrong, that the First Amendment protects people from government misinformation. But I should say, even if that were not the case, suppose the Great Barrington Declaration really were a fringe epidemiology, which it is not. It was absolutely standard, regular epidemiology. But if it were wrong, still the First Amendment would protect it, right? There's no truth standard for speech. So what we have then is a censorship two-step right? On the one hand, the government funds NGOs and universities to develop a hit list of social media censorship. It was prohibited by the July 4th district court decision, but then the circuit court, the appeals court lifted that. So it's still now legal for the Stanford Internet Observatory, for MIT, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, and University of Washington to act to suppress, to tell social media companies who and what to censor, and for the government to pay them to do so. Right? That, even if we win the preliminary injunction, that will still be legal. That's something I think Congress can deal with and ought to deal with. Congress ought to say the US government should not be funding private actors to further the censorship activities of the government. So, and actually, there's an interesting thing about this. The Stanford Internet Observatory people, in response to this criticism, what they've said, and this is in fact, the Stanford University filed an amicus brief against me in this case, arguing that the Internet Observatory was simply doing research. Let me ask you, those of you who do research, when you do research and you fill out a human subjects form, are you allowed to say that the purpose of the research is to harm your research subjects? Because that's the only purpose of this research, if it's research. Right? It's deeply unethical research if it is actually research. The government leans on social media companies to censor people and ideas in social media settings based on this hit list. That's prohibited under both the district court and the circuit court rulings. And God, I hope that the Supreme Court upholds at least that. So we're waiting for the Supreme Court's decision. We'll know hopefully by June whether they uphold the preliminary injunction. If they don't, we're still going to have the case. We're still going to try the case, and we'll know over the course of years whether that was wrong. We could still win the case, actually. But you know, the First Amendment is online here. What are the stakes then? Well, I'm going to end with this slide. So first, let me just say about public health. I already mentioned this. The premise of public health censorship is the government always gets things right, and we've seen during the pandemic that is not true. The health and well-being of the public depend on the right of citizens and scientists that are outside the government to criticize the government. And the First Amendment protects that. So the First Amendment is a vital tool for the health of the public. I'm at MIT. This is a university devoted to the idea that science is good for humanity. Science itself can't function without a First Amendment, right? So just think about what happened with Galileo. The problem with Galileo is that you have a printing press that allows him to spread his ideas widely, and this undermines the authority of the church. The authority of the church then is used to try to suppress the spread of his ideas. The Enlightenment happens because people reject that authority. We should be able to talk to each other about science openly, even wrong science, so that we can correct each other. The Enlightenment is we can speak to each other about our scientific ideas. That's a primary premise of the Enlightenment. We actually stand at the precipice of a new Enlightenment. We have the internet that vastly increases the amount of interconnectivity and communication with other people. And what's happening is the authorities have decided that it's too dangerous for us to speak with each other about scientific matters. So it's not just public health that's at stake, but science itself is at stake in the decisions that are coming up. Okay, you guys, that is, how long will I do? I've got 10 minutes for questions. Well, you guys asked me questions during, so.
I know you're limited on time, but this seems to exclude a really important actor, which is the press. I mean, the press has traditionally been the defenders of the First Amendment. And in this case, when there are these questions of the government censoring, they go either to the government to ask, hey, who's right here? They go to Fauci and say, people are saying you're censoring, who's right? Or they go to doctors and scientists who get their funding directly from
pharma or the government.
From the government, right? In order to say who's right. So it seems like that's the actor as well who's really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for there's one narrow economic thing you can say, right? So the social media companies are direct competitors with the press, with the traditional press, and social media and the press views them as direct competitors. Like they've taken away their funding model via the advertising. For them, they view this censorship of social media as hobbling its main competition. Right? I think that's a large part of what the press has been up to during the pandemic, I think the close collaboration between the press and the government and pharma. Well, pharma is completely understandable. The primary source of advertising for ABC, NBC, all these like news stations is pharma companies, right? They're not going to bite the hand that feeds them, and it's just so much easier to do the story that says, look, Dr. Fauci, who's the science, says Jay's wrong. Right? It's just laziness. The problem is that social media allows regular people to criticize them. It makes them look bad. Right? So it's not surprising, I guess, in one sense, the press, but I don't really care. Right? They'll just go away. If they keep telling lies, eventually people will stop listening to them. They're not all powerful. Their power comes from the government saying these are the facts, and Jay is a fringe.
Can I just add a couple other mechanisms of censorship that are really important? One is the sort of the government and/or pharma-sponsored disinformation actors out there. In the UK they have the 77th Brigade, basically just a bunch of people sponsored. You have a lot of pharma people. There's a pretty well-known recent PhD in genomics who was a captain in the army who's just sort of jumped onto Twitter and doing it. And so that's one way. One thing they did.
So can I follow on that, because I think that's a very important fact, right? So when there was a drug called Vioxx. Vioxx was a pain reliever drug that was supposedly reduced the amount of stomach side effects. It turns out it caused clotting, and Merck knew it and hid it. There were outside scientists that found that it caused clotting and were publishing papers. Merck hired doctors and other people to go and smear and destroy the reputations of the scientists that were exposing Vioxx. So that's exactly what the pharma companies did during the pandemic.
And the other brief thing in terms of restricting information is the FOIA process. One example I can give you is right now I have a friend who's been trying to get info from NIH about a 2021 study that basically someone in NIH effectively forced the retraction. It was a paper called Zhang and May 2021.
Well, look, I'll tell you. So I didn't used to know what B4 and B5 redactions are. See that? See this? Look at this. It says B4. B4 means we just don't want you to know it because it might embarrass us, basically. I'm not, this is not the technical thing, but that's essentially what it is. It's not classified. Why is this redacted? What good reason is there for the American people not to know what Zuckerberg promised Fauci?
And also, Francis Collins, up until the summer of 2021, was actually involved in redacting some of
the lab leak stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's disgusting. The NIH has been the least transparent federal organization. One, two.
Sorry, one last, can I just
Oh.
do a plug for friends?
Sure.
A documentary called Epidemic of Fraud about the kneecapping of hydroxychloroquine and a lot of sort of machinations within the White House, basically to sort of.
I mean, the information operation. I mean, it's going to take a long time to unravel the information operation.
It's a great documentary.
Yeah. Thanks.
So a lot of people know Eisenhower warning about the military-industrial complex, but they forget that in that same speech he warned about a scientific technocratic elite and how free inquiry was going to become more and more dependent on government contracts. And I think we live at a very interesting moment of transformation where not just the pandemic, but Oppenheimer coming out this past year, really showing how science and politics are intertwined, and how the government can borrow the prestige of science for its own ends. I was wondering if from what you've seen, there are new ideas on the table as to how scientists can interact directly with the public and pursue sources of funding that aren't so contract-based.
I mean, I say, like, I'm a government-funded scientist. Like, most of my career, I've gotten most of my money from the NIH. And the universities, like I teach in a medical school, in order to get promoted up to professor, which I am, I needed to have the NIH funding. Right? It was a marker for success as a scientist to get a large NIH grant. It's a very difficult thing to undo that, because a huge chunk of resources for scientists, but not just money, prestige, and comes from gaining government funding. It's never been seen as a source of conflict of interest to have government funding, right? It's the way you avoid conflict of interest. If you have pharma, you have conflicts of interest, but if you have government funding, it's not. It's going to be, what you just described is a very real thing, and it's a very difficult and challenging thing to undo. And I don't know how to undo it. But the scientific community should understand, if we don't work to undo some of this damage, the American public is not going to trust us. They already have lost trust in us. And the support that we've long enjoyed from the American public to do the work we've done will disappear.
I was just going to add on to this gentleman's comment, which is that I was kicked off of Twitter for pointing out the fact that NIH had $400 million worth of royalty coming from Moderna, just across the street here. And now I see BioNTech is suing, or NIH is suing BioNTech for being in default of not paying them their sum. So,
I mean, it's
has $1 billion in royalty from their patent estate on the vaccine. So there's a tremendous amount of conflict that's in NIH, who is governing.
I mean, the Bayh-Dole Act it needs to get repealed immediately, right? So basically what it means is that the NIH scientists can develop a patentable idea, patent it, and the NIH can make recommendations about whether or not to take the drugs that are under the patent, supposedly under two different groups, and then they can make recommendations to to destroy the reputations of scientists that have other drugs that are not under NIH patents.
You mentioned two different groups, but the ethics committee was run by Fauci's wife. So.
I know. I mean, even the appearance of a conflict of interest there is horrible, right? Yeah, I mean, it's bad. These are reforms we have to demand of whoever is elected president next. Oh, sorry.
The gentleman there started the line of questioning that I wanted to pursue. We're kind of self-congratulating ourselves here. It's always.
Oh, I think we failed, actually. I'm not congratulating anybody.
Go
Yeah.
to the meeting. So I'm going to kind of piss on this parade.
Please.
And I always do that, so it's easy. And that's not to denigrate what you had done. I've been watching you from the very first memo you wrote. But at the end, the battle was lost. Let's just look at it. It was lost. The government, or whoever wanted it, had won. The curfews and etc. held on. You didn't even discuss, but I'm part of it, and I study it, how much money was pumped into the economy, and we're still dealing with inflation and etc. So, despite your best efforts and those of us who signed and whatever, we lost.
We lost.
So my interest now is to think of what do we do with the next crisis coming. And I don't think everyone is going to agree with me if I use this example. But, you know, the human effect on climate change is another thing. And, you know, here I'm sure that some will agree with what I said about having lost, but not necessarily agree with my skepticism regarding the human effect. And so it is exactly the same what's happening, and it's happening right now. The heavy hand of government, the heavy hand of funding, much heavier hand than it was during the COVID crisis.
It's going to keep going.
And I would like us or you to concentrate, if possible, in the remaining 4 minutes of what can be done. What have we learned so that 7 or 5 years from now, someone, perhaps not you, doesn't stand here and said, we did everything and we lost.
So first of all, let me just say that's not pissing on the parade. That's just reality. We lost. We lost every single debate. The schools closed, the churches closed. We spent trillions of dollars. We have the inflation. We have the learning loss. We have the death of millions of people to show for it. So I entirely agree with you. Maybe I'm being naive on this, but I don't think we would have lost had there been free speech. I think if free speech had held during the pandemic, it would have been impossible to sustain the arguments that led to us losing. And I don't know. I'm an epidemiologist. I'm a health economist. I don't do work in physics and climate change. It's hard not to look at it and be much more skeptical than I was about it before the pandemic, right? I'm skeptical about all, as a scientist, I'm skeptical about everything normally. I think the kinds of tools the government used to get its way need to be removed from the government toolbook altogether. And I think that's possible now that it's been exposed. These tools don't belong in a republic of free people. And I think, I can't guarantee they would solve the climate change problem or any other problem, but I do think that if they're going to be solved, it's going to be solved by removing those tools from the hand of government.
Specify what you think.
Well, we've talked about some of them. So like conflicts of interest within the government itself regarding what to fund, a pretty fundamental reshaping of universities of how they decide who and what to promote. Like grant funding from the government should not be seen as automatically better and above other sources. We should be reading the scientific results rather than how much money you get or what journal you publish in, right? We should, the CDC should have much less power, should be checked in its power. It shouldn't be able to make a recommendation and every court in the country takes it as gospel. The FDA should not be funded by pharma, which it is. I'm working on a white paper to try to list out these things. It's going to focus on public health because that's what I know. But I think that the idea is more general, and of course, free speech should be restored. So I think the pandemic failure could be a lever to really restore science to what it ought to be. But I can't see the future. That's what I'm going to work toward.
A really important part of
I see you in a second.
fostering free speech, separate from the government and the First Amendment, is a culture of free speech. And I think the thing that we've lost over the past decade is that culture of free speech, as liberalism as we knew it became supplanted by more of a left-wing ideology that does not value free speech as much. So I think having the population value free speech more, I think, would be a big part of pushing back against government scholarship.
I agree with you about that. I'll say I actually think the public at large wants free speech, right? Whenever I present these facts, I get people are horrified by it. Very, very few people would say, oh yeah, it's justified. Even people that disagreed with me during the pandemic wouldn't say it's justified. I think the bigger problem is in academic circles, right? 100 of my colleagues wrote a secret petition trying to get me silenced by the president of the university. The faculty senate of Stanford University essentially excommunicated my colleague Scott Atlas for the crime of saying the kinds of things I was saying. I got you in a second. Yeah. The elite of American society. I don't even know if the elite is the right word. The professors, the professoriate have decided that free speech is not a good thing. Free speech leads to Trump. Free speech leads to Brexit. Free speech leads to all kinds of terrible things. And I think that needs to change. That's really where the danger is. And I agree with you about the culture. 1, 2.
Me?
Yep.
Something to consider for free speech when you give your speeches. The First Amendment is the most important. was the last part of the First Amendment, right to redress the government, petition the government for redress grievances. The reason is I can stick my foot in your mouth. You don't have free speech. The only thing that's going to stop that is going to the government and saying to this guy to take his foot out of my mouth, right? Either criminal or civil.
Yeah.
So what's standing in the way, and this wraps up your whole presentation. Standing doctrine is it. That's what's depriving us of all our rights. You cited the second prong of Lujan on traceability. It was Lujan versus Defenders of Wealth. The worst case is the 2009 Ashcroft versus Iqbal. 256,000 times it's been cited since 2009. It's the plausibility standard you probably.
I don't. So this is not. I'm not a lawyer. So what? So please describe it. Yeah.
I want you to understand why the right to redress is so much more important.
Yeah.
You can't protect the first, the rest of the first, the assembly, the speech, or the religion, without the right to petition the government to redress grievances.
Yeah.
Modeled after the Massachusetts Constitution, Article 15, which has, let's see, cases and controversies, you have the right that is to be, the exact wording, to be held sacred for a jury trial. You're talking about injunctive relief. You don't get a jury trial. It's in a court of equity or chancery, which is different from a court of law. So that's why they call it enjoining, right?
Yeah.
Because you're enjoining somebody. And the judge can go beyond the law. But in your presentation, it all wraps up very nicely if you go to the right to redress, supporting the free speech.
Right.
And that it's being undermined by standing doctrine, which has been a scope creep for over 100 years, and manifested in not just, Lujan put a wrapper around the prior 100 years of standing doctrine, and it was nice. It's a three-pronged test. It's got to be concrete, particularized. That's your injury in fact as your first prong. You probably know this language I'm saying, right? You're seeing it?
Yes.
And then traceability is the second, and redressability is the third. I won't get into the mere
Yeah.
speculative on the redressability. But that was even extended in Iqbal versus Ashcroft. They grabbed a guy after 9/11. He was Pakistani in New York City. They beat him up, and then they deported him. He sued not only the prison guards, but all the way up to the Attorney General, John Ashcroft. The first court, district court gave him standing. The appellate court gave him standing. The Supreme Court said, no, you don't have standing. Your claim is not plausible on its face. They could have easily used attenuation doctrine to throw it out, but instead, they used the plausibility claim. And like I said, 256,000 times it's been cited since 2009. And we as citizens don't get standing. So by the subjective whim of any judge, they can toss any case out.
Yeah.
You had a good judge in your case, but that wouldn't happen in Massachusetts. That wouldn't happen in, say, California or Maine. We don't have good judges, right? So giving them the opportunity to toss a case on their own subjective whims is the problem. Standing doctrine is the problem.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I sat there in slack-jawed listening to the Supreme Court justices discuss the case, and specifically the standing issue, just stunned. Like the idea that American citizens don't have the right to say that the government has violated our free speech, that there's no standing to sue.
When Missouri and Texas brought Pennsylvania to court over the election, remember Pennsylvania broke their own laws? That was tossed to attorney generals because it goes directly to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said you don't have standing, and they cited Iqbal versus Ashcroft.
But I think I don't know. Like I've never been to a Supreme Court hearing before. By the way, I got chills up my spine, like sitting there in front of there's 9 justices, and it was really amazing. But and I left depressed. But I've been reading obsessively all of the close watchers of the Supreme Court, and most of them think that we're going to win on the standing issue, for what it's worth. Yeah, I mean, because I do think that if we lose that, you're right. I mean, I really believe the First Amendment is dead.
The language shouldn't even exist. They can hear the cases. Now, I don't know if that guy's an economist over there. He mentioned, he alluded to being an economist. But if you look at it from an economics perspective, you have the inverse of Pareto efficiency, right? You're getting to any change to the system is going to make it better.
Yeah.
Standing should not exist because if they adjudicated cases, here's an example. 130,000 extra cases were brought to 2020 in federal courts alone. 130,000. So they can't hear them. So what do? You're out, standing. They denied people their rights. But if they heard the first case, they would all the other cases that followed
Would just follow,
the same legal theories. they would have been settled. They wouldn't have even brought the cases. They
Yeah.
would have given justice to the American people.
Yeah, I entirely agree. I mean, I wasn't so aware about the importance of the standing issue until I was listening to the Fifth Circuit Appeals Court, because that was a central contention there, and that's when I started to get really alarmed. And then when the Supreme Court heard it, I got really alarmed. So I agree with you. That's a very important thing.
Around
Yeah.
the whole country, they don't know how to go after this because they have to treat the client before them. They have a fiduciary duty to the client. They can't tank 9 to win the 10th, and then we can get rid of standing.
Yeah.
So it's a strategic thing. Sorry, I don't.
No. I mean, I agree with you about the stakes. There was someone over here that had their hand up. Oh, yep.
I'm just reacting to the gentleman in front of me, previous point about the importance of culture and how, I mean, I'm kind of disappointed and yet amazed. I mean, how many people are in this audience here, and this is all we can do? I mean, you represent pretty much everything that I think is important about medicine. I work at Mass General and I'm a professor at Harvard Medical School. We have diversity of every kind there, except for thought. And it's disappointing as hell. And
It's the same.
I appreciate that, unfortunately. However, there's a little glimmer of hope. I learned about 8 months ago from the Wall Street Journal, nothing from Harvard, that there's a Council for Academic Freedom that, they took me in from the, some of you may know the Groucho Marx. I wouldn't want to join any organization that would take me as a member. But there's a little glimmer of hope there in that there is a desire for free speech. And I disagree with most of the people at all of, well, 97% by numbers of people's political views at Harvard University. However, in this little enclave, they disagree with me, but it's okay that I talk.
I mean, this is the old liberal idea, right? This was like the civic religion in the United States is free speech, is what I thought before the pandemic.
Right.
And I entirely agree. I mean, I think the court cases are, I mean, I think they're necessary, but very far from sufficient. But I don't, I've talked to a very large number of people during the pandemic, just based on how visible I was. And my sense is that, and maybe selection bias, but like most of the regular people are not in favor of this regime. They don't want to be looking over their shoulder whenever they write something on Facebook. They don't want to be, they don't like this. And they feel like their rights are being violated. It's just academics.
Yeah, I wish I agreed with you, but not around here. Not around here. And then just totally tangentially, but to one of the very important points that you made earlier about children and masks, it was really difficult to get out the information that, God forbid the child did get COVID. They shrug it off like a cheap suit. I mean, this isn't polio. This doesn't, condemn them to a horrible life. It's a cold. And that information, which was really important and suppressed as well.
This was the basis of the Great Barrington Declaration,
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
So it's
But, I mean, that information, you tried to bring it out, and
no, it's in epidemiology and medicine. We look for risk factors, like we design our strategies, our therapeutic strategies around risk factors, right? Small risk factors, you can exploit them. Personalized medicine, that's the whole point of it, right? This was a risk, like 1,000-fold or more difference in the risk of dying if you get COVID. How could we ignore that risk factor in designing our policy? It was crazy.
thank you.
So it does seem like one of the most pernicious parts is how this has divided society, right? There are some people that are just so convinced that I mean, I think everyone believes that's misinformation. You just can't agree about what misinformation is. And you said that people are very reasonable and agree with you. I mean, you had 100 colleagues who tried to shun you and destroy you. Have you come up with ways of like talking with family and friends and colleagues that have such radically different views than you? And have you figured out a way to kind of get them to watch a lecture like this?
I mean, they're more open now than they were before. It's been tough. Like I just say personally, like my own family, my most immediate family, my wife was more anti-lockdown than me. So, and my son, he was like my kids were agreed with us. I was really afraid my notoriety would harm them. So I did my very best to try to not get involved locally for that reason, because I didn't want them to be harmed. I didn't want the teachers to hold anything against them. But my in-laws, my father-in-law and mother-in-law, they stayed indoors for 3 years. They wouldn't listen to me. And they were listening to CNN. So I don't know. I convinced my mom to leave the house. So that was a big, but that took a year.
Well, your study in March of 2020 on the seroprevalence was the biggest game changer for the entire.
It should have ended our policy.
Well, I mean, I think that it really set the battle lines where I think people who were being skeptical had something to hold their hat to, and I really think that was.
But there, that led to a vicious attack on me and my family in the press. There's discussions, entire FOIA emails, what I didn't show you, almost entirely redacted, discussing our study inside the federal government, including Tony Fauci. They didn't change their policy, right? The upshot of the study was that like 3% of Santa Clara County and 4% of LA County had already had COVID by early April 2020. This is not a disease you can stop. It's either 0 or 100, right? That meant that the lockdowns weren't going to protect anybody ultimately.
It also said the fatality wasn't
0.2% was we found. I mean, it's the median infection fatality rate of all the seroprevalence studies done in 2020 is like 0.27%. So we got it right. So it's a little bit. But we had a younger sample in Santa Clara County, right? So it's. I don't know. I mean, back then I was just a scientist. I was so naive. I thought, here I'm doing this piece of science, people will use it. Instead, what happened was attacks on me within the university, death threats, attacks on my family in the press, a hit piece on my wife. It was a perversion of what I thought science was about.
I'll just counter with another legal scholar, George Carlin. So you should listen to his piece called Rights. So he says they're God-given rights, right? Well, how come we have the 10 and a Bill of Rights, but Belgium has 16 and England has 13? Whatever. There's no exact. God didn't agree on some specific number of rights, and we added a bunch afterwards. So these rights are fungible, they're malleable, and he says basically at the end of the day you have politicians, and these aren't rights; these are privileges, and you get what you can get. And the default position of man, just leave George Carlin, the default position of mankind is certainly not rights. They're not God-given rights. It's rights de seigneur, it's the majesty, and so forth. So the humanity has always been under the foot of somebody. And so the only way you get out is by education and by re-education and continued education. So H.L. Mencken, the other legal scholar, said democracy is principle by which people vote for what they want and they deserve to get it, good and hard. and so, we on the other hand, we had the Vietnam War, and that's its own tragedy. The Ukraine War is its own tragedy. And then people, they develop, their own immune reactions. There's a herd immunity to other events, not just, viruses. There's a herd immunity, for better or for worse, to the Vietnam War. I'm not saying all the information was accurately presented somewhere, but people had a disaffinity to do another Vietnam War for some length of time. And then, the Iraq War cured some of that. Anyway, so people have a learning curve. It may not be fast enough to prevent this in the acute, but and then Milton Friedman said, you don't get rid of politicians. You change the people's viewpoints, so the politicians have to adapt. They're good at being idiots and assholes.
Well,
but they're politicians.
I mean,
Their job is to adapt to your
Randy, I think the upshot is, and I think this is you heard this in like the questions about culture and about what do we do next. I interviewed a man named Jonathan Sumption in 2021, who's the Supreme Court Justice in the UK. And it was actually quite depressing talking with him. Like in his view, first, the UK doesn't have a constitution, right, a written constitution. And if the government says that there's no free speech rights, there's just tradition. And if people have abandoned that tradition, then it's gone. And so the question that you and I had, the disagreement we had about the people, do they agree with us about free speech rights or not? Are they still liberal? Is it still a civic religion? That is the key question.
Well, yeah, there's
That's
a lot-
that is,
so-
and apart from that, I don't think reform is possible. If we really do live in a society where that is not, that we don't have that fundamental liberal, small L liberal idea, I mean, I don't know what, I don't know what you do. I don't know what you do next. I mean,
I wanted to thank you for the observation at the beginning that Galileo was also a fringe extremist.
Wind it down.
Okay.
But also,
Sure.
I think this actually kind of links up to the conversation we've been having. But have you spoken to RFK Jr. regarding his platform? And I know he is a long shot candidate, but I think he's having a significant impact on the Overton window. And he specifically has been speaking about regulatory capture as a major driver of a lot of the corruption that we see, with the FDA and the NIH. We talked obviously earlier about how the financial incentive maybe even created a lot of like the NPIs that persisted in order to push everything towards the vaccine. RFK Jr. I think has the opportunity at least to shift the Overton window in a positive direction to have that cultural impact that could potentially inoculate us against these terrible.
So I'm in public health. I don't endorse candidates, but I have spoken with him. In fact, I spoke at this campaign event of his where he announced the vice president, and I spoke in favor of free speech. They invited me because I was going to speak in favor of free speech, and I really admire that. And we should hold all our political candidates to that standard. I don't know. I mean, it's an open question. I hope you guys are wrong about that. I hope desperately. I think at the very least, even if you all are right and I'm wrong about that, we should act as if I'm right. We should advocate as if I'm right, because it's really the only hope is the people agree that we shouldn't live under this kind of authority that decides that one man can deem himself the science itself and then and impose his will on the rest of the world. That is not the kind of world I think we ought to live in. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.